This production was brought to you by Zelgert Books, Allegorical Science Fiction by Andrew Zelgert. Victoria by Andrew Zelgert, read by the author. Chapter 1. The Terrible News. Once upon a time, there was a young woman named Victoria. She was a happy, free-spirited individual who enjoyed life not for the sport of it, but because she truly loved everything the universe had to offer. Every morning, she would step outside on her way to the movie theater through the busy streets, saying hello to everyone as she went. "Hello, officer," said Victoria as she passed by a policeman who was arresting a man. "Hello, Victoria," said the officer, who looked up from his work. "Good to see you." "How's life?" asked Victoria. "The usual," said the officer. "Petty thefts and such. Still trying to solve this here crossword." He pulled out a crossword book and pointed to one of the rows. 5-letter word for a thin plant. "I do believe that would be grass," said Victoria. "By golly, you're right!" cried the officer. He quickly filled in the crossword, and as he did so, the criminal he was arresting attempted to walk away. "Oh, not so fast!" said the officer as he grabbed the robber. Victoria did not notice this, however, because she was already moving her way through the streets. "Hello, Miss Anne," said Victoria to a young woman. The woman turned and said, "Why, hello, Victoria, off to the cinema?" "Yup," said Victoria. "They have a new movie playing and I cannot wait to see it." "Enjoy," said Miss Anne. "Have you by chance seen my dog?" "I don't think I have," said Victoria. Just then a loud woof came from somewhere above, and they looked up to see Miss Anne's dog sitting on the roof of a house with its tongue sticking out energetically. "How the dickens did that little rascal get up there?" asked Miss Anne with a laugh. "I will need a stepladder." She reached down and picked up a stepladder from within the bushes. "Thank goodness Mr. Miggs loaned this to me to clean my gutters." "Good luck with that, Miss Anne," said Victoria as she walked on by. "Good morning, Victoria," said the baker as he walked out of the bakery with a fresh basket of breads. Victoria took a deep breath in and said, "Oh, who are those for?" "They are for the seniors down the street," said the baker. He smiled at Victoria, then hopped on his motorcycle and took off to make his delivery. Victoria walked past many other people, including a watchmaker, an author, a woodworker, a schoolteacher, who also needed help with a crossword, and a young girl picking out a prom dress. After a time, Victoria came to the movie theater, paid for her ticket, and anxiously sat down in her usual seat within the massive room. Moments later, the movie began to play, and Victoria sat back, fully immersed in the film. She did not care that she was the only person who bothered to come to this place anymore. She was supporting a local business and enjoyed how each movie was a different adventure. In a way, she was able to enjoy adventures she would otherwise be unable to take part in, whether it be digging up buried treasure, exploring other planets, swimming to the bottom of the ocean, or witnessing an apocalypse. When the movie was over, Victoria got up from her seat with slight discomfort due to her legs falling asleep during the feature. After spending a moment shaking them awake, she smiled at the custodian and turned towards the exit. "Say, Victoria," asked the custodian. Victoria turned back and smiled even wider. "Yes?" she asked. "Do I not get a hug at least?" asked the custodian, who opened his arms for a hug. Victoria smiled even more and reached over and hugged her father. "How has your day been?" he asked. "Wonderful, Dad," she said. "Jimmy needed help with the crosswords again. Miss Anne's dog got stuck on her roof, and the baker is off to deliver freshly baked breads to the senior center." She spent the next 10 minutes explaining to her father all of the wonderful things she had witnessed from the day. And when she had finished, her father beamed at her. "Sounds like you've had quite a morning," he said as he leaned on his mop for support. "Yes, it has been pretty nuts," replied Victoria. She looked around at the empty theater seats and asked, "Has anyone else come to watch something?" "Unfortunately, no," said her father sadly. "Nobody except you." "Oh," said Victoria. "Well, there's always tomorrow." "Victoria, I need to talk to you about something," said the custodian. Victoria's smile faded slightly and said, "Okay." "Today is my last day here," said Victoria's father. "What?" cried Victoria. Why? Why did they fire you? They didn't fire you, did they? No, said the custodian with a heavy sigh. We did not receive our grant this year. We do not have enough funds to stay afloat. I will help you pay for it, said Victoria desperately. I can help you with your business. I'm sorry, Victoria, but we close at 2:00, responded her father. Tears began to well up in the young woman's eyes, and she reached for her father's arms, and they hugged for a little while. But you'll be out of a job, whimpered Victoria. The custodian sighed heavily and said, Yes, I know. Victoria looked up at her father with her tear-stained cheeks and asked, What are you going to do? Victoria's father reached out a hand and placed it on her shoulder. We'll find a way, he said with a smile. Victoria cried a little more. Then the custodian pulled out a stopwatch from his pocket. The young woman stopped crying and looked at the fancy golden watch, which had 7 multicolored hands pointing at different locations on the timepiece. She had never understood her father's obsession with this watch, because the time was almost always incorrect, yet her father always pretended it worked. 10:38, said the custodian as he pocketed the pocket watch. He then turned to face the projector screen and murmured, Nearly here. Victoria straightened up and looked over at her father as the tears on her face slowly dried up. What's almost here? She asked with a sniffle. Her father turned and smiled. Nothing for you to be concerned about. He put an arm around her and held his daughter for a moment to comfort her, then said, You best be off. You surely have things you need to attend to. He gave his daughter a salute and walked out of the theater room. Victoria, who was still in tears, was now standing in the room, completely and utterly alone. Chapter 2. The Repeating Mess. Victoria walked down the streets again, this time with her head hung low. Hey, Victoria, what's wrong? Asked the baker, who was pulling up to the bakery in his motorcycle. Victoria looked up at the baker with her tear-stained eyes and sighed. Trying to act as if nothing was wrong, she asked, Did the seniors enjoy the bread? The baker frowned and asked, What do you mean? The seniors, said Victoria again. Did they enjoy the bread you baked for them earlier? I didn't bake any bread today, responded the baker with a frown. Victoria stopped walking and frowned as well. Sure you did, she said. I distinctly remember you telling me that. But I've only baked a cake for Miss Anne's birthday, said the baker. Are you sure you're feeling okay? Miss Anne's birthday? Asked Victoria. It's not her birthday. But it is, said the baker. Go see for yourself. Victoria hurried down the streets towards Miss Anne's house. Upon looking up, she noticed that her dog was no longer on the rooftop, and inside the home, she could hear the faint sounds of Happy Birthday being sung by Miss Anne's relatives. Victoria frowned and knocked on the door. A man answered the door, and Victoria rushed inside. Victoria! Cried Miss Anne. I was worried you had forgotten about me. Victoria frowned and said, But we just saw each other an hour or two ago. We did? Asked Miss Anne. I don't remember seeing you today at all. Remember your dog got stuck on the roof, said Victoria with a laugh. Dog? Asked one of the relatives. What dog? Miss Anne's dog, said Victoria with another laugh. Miss Anne frowned at Victoria and said, I thought you knew better not to lie to people, Victoria. Victoria frowned and stared at the older woman. I do not own a dog, said Miss Anne. I just told all this to my father, said Victoria. I can go ask him. He will tell you, I promise. Your father is dead, said Miss Anne. There was a silence. No, he isn't, said Victoria in a shaky voice. I'm confident of that. I just talked to him. He's in perfect health. Some of the adults in the room began to murmur to one another about things that Victoria could not hear, but she did not care. She had no idea if this was some kind of prank everyone was pulling on her, but whatever it was, she was not amused. Victoria, your father has been dead since you were born, said one of the adults, and there were nods of agreement. But, began Victoria, you were orphaned, said Miss Anne. "I helped raise you, remember?" "But he's at the movie theater," said Victoria, who was becoming hopelessly confused. "Movie theater? What movie theater?" asked another adult. "There's no such place," said a second. Victoria looked down at her shoes and put her hands in her pockets. Her right hand grasped something metallic, and she slowly pulled it out. In her right pocket was her father's pocket watch. More tears began to form in her eyes as she realized what everyone was saying was right. Had she imagined the whole day? Had any of it actually happened? Or was this her imagination attempting to heal what could not be mended? More tears formed in her eyes, and she ran out of the house. Heavy rain poured down upon the now abandoned streets. She could not believe that for a brief moment that day, she thought her father had been alive. She sat down on a soaked park bench and bowed her head low and put her hand in her hands. She could not believe the day she had had. She sat there for a long time, long enough for the rain to stop and the street lamps to turn on, reflecting the hazy atmosphere in every direction, the depressing thoughts swallowing her whole like a plant choking her throat. After a little while, she got up and sadly walked down the cold, dark streets towards home. When she approached the door, she inserted the key and turned the knob and stepped inside. She reached over to flick the lights on, however, when the light switch was clicked, no light came into the room. The power was out. She sighed heavily and walked over to where her dining room table was and sat down, her waterlogged clothes puddling water onto the unseen hardwood floor below. She spread her arms onto the table and she felt a sheet of paper. She slowly raised her head up and felt her way towards the table and picked up the sheet of paper. She brought it over to the doorway, and by the light of the moon in the doorway, she read the following message. "Dear Victoria, I am gone now. If you wish to find me, I'm at the place where logic breaks." Victoria frowned and read the note a couple more times over. "Funny, isn't it?" asked a gruff voice. Victoria jumped out of her skin and by natural impulse grabbed a steak knife on the dining room table. She raised the sharp object in front of her and whipped around the dark house nervously. There was silence. She slowly backed away towards the cold, dark entryway when suddenly she felt cold metal against her throat. "If I were here to kill you, you would already be dead," said a gruff voice from behind her, and Victoria dropped her knife. Victoria felt the sharp metal lift from her neck, and she attempted to make a mad dash for the exit. A firm hand grabbed her, however, and she didn't make it clear of the entryway to the house. "Not so fast, missy," said the gruff voice. Victoria looked around into the dark, and a pair of glowing red eyes could be seen through the pitch black within her home. "What do you want?" whispered Victoria. "What do I want?" repeated the gruff voice. "Nothing that concerns you." "Then why are you here?" asked Victoria. "Because you need to be collected," said the gruff voice. "During the cleanup process, you were forgotten. All of the evidence was gone except for you. We cannot allow you to stay here, of course, for legal reasons. You're polluting our hard work." "Your hard work?" began Victoria, but she did not get a chance to finish. "Do you want to see your father again or not?" asked the gruff voice. Victoria's heart stopped. For a few moments she could not speak. What did you do with him?" she asked. "Me? Nothing," said the gruff voice. "I bring people places. I do not care about why. That's somebody else's problem." Suddenly a massive purple doorway appeared out of the darkness, a glowing rectangle of nothing. Victoria could tell somebody large was standing in front of it, but could not tell any more from the limited silhouette. She felt her arm being grabbed as she was brought towards the strange purple doorway. "Where are we going?" she squealed. "This way," said the gruff voice, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "No, seriously, where are we going?" cried Victoria. A low chuckle came from her captor. "We're going beyond cardinality," he said, "to the realm of the ordinals." With that, they entered the door, and Victoria was consumed by the abyss. Chapter 3. Aleph Null. Victoria and her captor emerged from the purple rectangle into an odd bustling room full of stick figures. A massive escalator before them. Her captor pushed her forward and they slowly but steadily approached the escalator. "Welcome to Aleph Null," said a robotic female voice. "The home of the Cardinals, how may I help you?" Victoria turned and realized she and her captor were being spoken to by one of the stick figures, who was holding a clipboard. Victoria quickly became aware of the fact that there was no color in this place, only black outlines on a white background, almost to suggest as if they were in an empty coloring book. "We require the usage of your escalator," said Victoria's captor. "Oh, go ahead," said the stick figure in her robotic voice. She gestured for them to move forward, and another person from behind approached her. "Welcome to Aleph Null," repeated the stick figure to the new people. "The home of the Cardinals. How may I help you?" "We need to find our lost fraction," said the worry-stricken father. "Not to worry," said the stick figure. "We will send a team to search for him." Victoria tried to listen in more, but she could no longer hear the conversation due to the hum of the escalator. She nervously looked up at the man who had kidnapped her and observed him closely. He wore a black suit with matching tie, a black fedora, and had sunken eyes. If Victoria didn't know any better, she would have said this man was a gangster. The way he was dressed suggested he was a criminal. Yet on the way up the escalator, they passed several cops, and the man would politely tip his hat to them as if he knew every single one of them. Victoria's gaze then drifted over to the man's belt, where a revolver and a sword were kept. This worried her greatly. Her thoughts were interrupted shortly after because the man spoke in a perfectly ordinary voice. "So, how are you?" he asked pleasantly. Victoria stayed quiet. She did not like the fact that this man was trying to make conversation after kidnapping her. "Not the talkative type, eh?" asked the man with a chuckle. "I understand. I'm not typically very talkative myself." He stared up at the escalator, then sighed. "We have a long way to go," he said. "Might as well make the most of the time we have." He smiled at Victoria again, and in response, Victoria rolled her eyes. "Look, I'm just doing my job," said the man defensively. Victoria turned to face him and asked, "And what job is that?" "To bring you to my employer," replied the man. "Once we get to him, I leave you be. That's all, I give you my word." "Your word means nothing to me," said Victoria coldly. The man sighed again. "Look, I'm trying to lighten the situation," he said. "My name is Jack." He reached out a hand for Victoria to shake, but the young woman pushed his hand away. "I don't need your greeting," she said. "You kidnap me, tell me that you are responsible for ruining my life, and ask me if I want to see my father again. Do you really expect me to trust you?" The man shrugged and said, "Just doing my duty. I can't be blamed for that, can I?" "Duty should not get in the way of doing what's right," said Victoria. There was a silence between them. All that could be heard was the hum of the escalator underneath them. "Where are you taking me?" asked Victoria quietly. "To the realm of the Ordinals. I already told you that," laughed the man. "But what's so special about them?" asked Victoria. "They are the biggest anything you can imagine," said the man, who twirled around as if the very thought filled him with joy. He stopped for a second to think, then said, "Well, almost anything." The remainder of the escalator climb was held in silence until at long last they reached the top. Victoria gasped upon seeing a massive archway with the inscription Omega, carved in massive uppercase letters. "Wow," breathed Victoria. "This is the edge of the infinite," said Jack. "But that escalator was not infinite," contradicted Victoria. "That's because the infinity has been compacted into a set," said Jack. "A super task, if you will. Even though a finite amount of time has passed for us, we went up an infinite number of stairs to get here." As Victoria tried to comprehend what she had been told, Jack gestured for her to follow him towards the massive archway. The closer Victoria got to the entrance, the smaller she felt. The archway was gargantuan, bigger and more spectacular than any other building she had seen. It was at this moment that she heard a voice she recognized. "Jack, thank goodness!" Victoria looked over and saw an older man give Jack a pat on the back, and she suddenly remembered she was being held captive. She began to back away slowly when she stopped. The man Jack was talking to was her father. Victoria didn't need telling twice. She ran over to her dad and hugged him. "Victoria!" cried her father as he reached over and gave his daughter a big hug. "Oh, you got my letter. I was so worried. You didn't. I'd hope you had noticed. I sent Jack to fetch you. I got home late. I was told you had died," said Victoria. "I was so sad." Tears began to form in the young woman's eyes as she hugged her father again. "I missed you," she whispered through tears of joy. "I know," murmured her father as he patted her on the back gently to calm her down. "It's okay now. I'm here." Victoria let go, then frowned a little. "You sent this man to find me?" she asked, pointing at Jack. "Of course," said her father. "You must forgive his odd attire. It's his only wardrobe of choice. He wears it when he is feeling professional." "I see," said Victoria. "Anyway, come with me," said her father. "There is so much to show you." He gestured to Jack and Victoria to follow them, and they entered the massive archway and into the darkness. Chapter 4. The Alliance. After a moment of groping in the dark, they emerged in a very odd, flat, desert-like landscape. Her father and Jack cautiously began walking down from where the tunnel had been and into the sandy landscape. Victoria had to run over to them to catch up, kicking white sand into the air as she went. "Wait!" she cried. "Where are you going?" Her father turned to face her and said, "We need to make it to shelter before the sandstorm comes." "Sandstorm?" asked Victoria. "What? Where are we?" "I will explain on the way," said her father. "Just get down here." Victoria anxiously ran down to them and said, "Okay, why are we here? Or a better question, how did you get here? Or even, where is here?" "We're in the hourglass of the universe," said Jack. "Every account of everything is in here." "And why are we in here?" asked Victoria. "Because I lost something," said her father with a smile. "A pocket watch. It was very important to me, you see, and I need to find it." Victoria slowly reached into her pocket, and sure enough, her hand rested against the cold metal of the watch. She was about to pull it out, but her gut instinct told her not to. She was not entirely sure why, but she did not trust the circumstances. Something about the situation felt off. Victoria did not trust Jack and decided as soon as Jack left, she would give her father the watch. But how to tell her dad without Jack hearing? "Where's the best place to start looking, do you reckon?" asked Jack to her father. "Beats me," said Victoria's dad. "We might as well start here. If nobody finds the watch in 10 minutes, we head for shelter and wait the storm out." Jack nodded, and together the three began to search the sand for the watch. Victoria felt so bad she couldn't just hand the watch to her father. He would have been so proud, but still could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. She was expecting Jack to react at any second. He was armed, after all, and Victoria was not going to put anything past him. He claimed he worked for father, but Victoria found that unlikely. 10 minutes came and went, and the winds had picked up considerably since they had started. The sandstorm was coming nearer and nearer. "All right, let's go," said her father. He got up from the sandy ground, dusted himself off, then began to walk towards a hut sitting below on a flat desert plain. They slowly slid down the sandy slope and approached the hut. After knocking a couple times, the door opened and the three of them went inside. Victoria's first reaction to the hut was the smell of dead animals. The sounds of bugs flying around could be heard, and raw meat was laying about on various sandstone counters. Sharp knives hung on the walls, and an elderly woman sat by the door with a toothy smile on her face. "Long time no see, Walter," said the woman in her gravelly voice. Walter smiled at her and nodded. "It's nice to be visiting you in your humble abode," he said politely. Victoria, who was a clean freak, disliked all of the meat, flies, and mold. It was very unsanitary and made her uncomfortable. The smell was awful and she felt like she had to puke. "What do you need?" asked the woman. "Shelter," said Walter with a smile. "Oh, really?" asked the woman. "And may I ask what brings you to the hourglass of the universe?" "I am in search of my pocket watch," said Walter. The woman gave a knowing smile and then asked, "So everything has gone according to plan?" She looked over at Jack and Victoria, then back to Walter. "Absolutely," said Walter, who smiled back. Victoria had no idea what this meant, but she trusted her father that he would bring them to safety. The woman nodded at Walter and said, "Make yourself comfortable. The storm will not pass for a while." Walter sat down on a moldy armchair and put his feet up on the broken footrest and laid back, closing his eyes. Victoria felt bad for her father. He looked exhausted, almost as if he had spent many years on his feet without stopping. "So, how did you get here?" asked Victoria. Walter opened his eyes and looked up at her. "That is a long story," he said with a smile. "I have been planning to come here for a while now." "But you disappeared this morning," said Victoria in confusion. "The realm of the ordinals is complicated," replied Walter. "There is an order to where things are placed, but there is no measure to anything anywhere." He looked around and said, "Hence why I need my pocket watch back. I cannot tell the true local time there without it." Victoria thought for a moment, then turned to look at Jack. She could not give the pocket watch to her father. Not yet. She would as soon as she gave Jack the slip. "Anyway," continued Walter. He stretched his legs and closed his eyes again, trying to relax. "Mr. Walter, sir?" asked Jack. "We have company." Walter immediately stood up straight and got out of his chair. "What?" he asked. "Guards from Aleph Knolls, sir," said Jack, pointing out of the cracked glass window of the hut into the blusterly sandy winds. "They are here for me," murmured the woman. "They have been searching for me for a very long time, and I've had to relocate more than once." Walter turned to face the woman and said, "If we keep you safe, will you help us find the watch?" The woman thought for a moment, then asked, "Do I still receive what is owed?" "Yes, you will receive double," said Walter, "upon my word." The woman gave a toothy smile and said, "All right, go ahead. Good luck." Walter smiled back at the woman and gestured for Jack to follow him. They both adorned themselves with raggedy cloths to protect their faces from the harsh winds, and stepped out of the hut, leaving Victoria alone with the woman. After a couple moments of awkwardly standing around, the woman spoke up. "So, you are Walter's daughter?" she asked quietly. Victoria was unsure how to respond to this, and silently nodded. "He talks about you quite a bit," continued the elderly woman. "Says you are part of his project." Victoria turned and asked, "What project?" "He has grand plans to get your family out of debt," said the woman with a thoughtful tone. "Quite a man, isn't he?" Victoria stared at the woman, then nodded silently. Just then the door opened again, and Walter stepped in. "Jack has run off to distract them. Now is your chance, my lady." Chapter 5. The Factory. A moment later, Walter, Victoria, and the elderly woman were all running from the hut in the middle of the sandstorm. The harsh winds grabbing them violently, threatening to push them down. As they ran, Victoria could barely make out Jack's silhouette off in the distance as several guards chased him into the storm. Gunshots could be heard off in the distance. Now is her chance to give her father the watch. She ran as fast as she could, but she was not fast enough to be next to her father. Walter simply ran too fast. "Not much farther," said Walter. He pulled out a walkie-talkie and spoke into it. "Jack, we are heading for the next gateway. Get over here now. The guards won't catch us. We have gained enough ground." "Understood," said Jack's voice through the walkie-talkie. Victoria realized she did not have a lot of time to give her father the watch. "Dad!" she shouted. "What?" shouted Walter over the sounds of the winds. "I have your watch!" shouted Victoria. Walter stopped immediately and turned to face her. "You what?" he shouted. "I have your watch!" shouted Victoria over the blustering winds. "How did you get it?" shouted Walter. "Last I saw it, I had it on me." "It somehow ended up in my pocket," shouted Victoria. "I assumed you had given it to me." "That's understandable," shouted Walter over the howling desert wind. "Give it to me and we can escape this madness." "How?" asked Victoria. "Just give me the watch and we can transport ourselves to a different location," shouted her father. "Just trust me." Victoria thought about it, then nodded. She handed the watch to her dad and he grabbed it. Walter turned the knobs on the top, and many hands on the watch began to turn wildly on their own. Blue light began to encircle them. Just then Jack ran up to them, followed closely behind by gunfire. "We have the watch!" shouted Walter. "My daughter had it for safekeeping! Let's go!" The blue light around them became more and more intense until in a flash, they were gone. Victoria opened her eyes and was greeted with the sounds of industrial machines. She slowly got up and looked around. Her father, Jack, and the elderly woman were already on their feet and were walking around what appeared to be a crude-looking assembly line. Hydraulic arms were moving around the conveyor belt, assembling different machinery and components. A metal robot with red eyes stomped its way towards Walter and said in a steely voice, "Welcome back, Walter." It saluted him, and Walter saluted back. Victoria was not sure what was going on, but decided to play along just like her dad was. "After the universal wipe, we were afraid you would never return," said the robot. "I assure you, General, I am quite all right," said Walter. The robot turned to face Victoria and its eyes glowed scarlet. "You have a hitchhiker, sir," it said, pointing at Victoria. "If you need me to, I will be more than happy to." "How dare you point at my daughter like that?" snarled Walter, and the robot immediately backed down. I'm sorry, sir. Apologies. Never meant it, sir," it said in a rush. "I will never do it again. I promise." "Good," snapped Walter. Victoria had never seen her father so perturbed in her life. She was grateful that he was able to keep the robot from harming her, though she did not trust the machine at all. "You will be pleased with the turnout, sir. We are ahead of schedule." "How many are finished?" inquired Walter. "Omega +1, said the robot in its steely voice. "We expect to have even more completed later on." "Excellent," said Walter. He turned and smiled at Victoria. "Want to see something amazing?" he asked. Victoria shrugged and nodded. Walter gave her a hug and then led her over to a massive pot that was pouring molten metal onto a conveyor belt of molds. "See this?" asked Walter. "Yeah?" asked Victoria. "Watch this," said Walter. He pulled a massive cast iron lever, and robotic arms run by hydraulics came down from the ceiling and proceeded to weld the different components together. The metal cooled surprisingly fast, and as Victoria walked down the assembly line, she noticed that more and more of the metal object was constructed, the more it resembled a face. A moment later, another conveyor belt brought over a robotic body, and the two were welded together, and a second later, the robot was powered on, marched off the conveyor belt, and stood next to her. Walter approached Victoria with his arms behind his back and admired the machine. "Isn't it wonderful?" he asked. Victoria wasn't sure what to think of the industrial-looking machine. It had raw metal, and its inner workings were all exposed. Two scarlet eyes were slowly pulsing eerily on its face, and part of the light reflected into its head. "What is it, Daddy?" she asked. "It's a commander," said Walter proudly. "A commander?" asked Victoria. "Of course," said Walter. He happily walked over to a door on the opposite end of the factory and gestured for Victoria to follow. Victoria nervously glanced at the robot, then followed her father through the doorway until they came to a massive chamber filled with robots. As they entered, billions upon billions of pairs of scarlet eyes turned in their direction. There were so many Victoria could not see the end of the sea of robots. A moment later, they all saluted Walter, and Walter saluted them back. "What is going on?" asked Victoria under her breath. Walter turned excitedly to face Victoria, placed a hand on her shoulder, then said, "I have finally figured out a way to get us out of debt." "What?" asked Victoria. "We won't have to live off of petty cash anymore, Victoria," said Walter. "Think about it. You and I living the high life. You and me. Forever." "What are you talking about?" asked Victoria. "I should probably start from the beginning," said Walter. "Walk with me." He gestured to a metal balcony overlooking the sea of robots, and together they slowly walked down it. For years, I've been trying to come up with a way to ensure you have the best future," said Walter. "However, there are board members in the realm of the ordinals that kept telling me I can't." "Board members?" asked Victoria curiously. "Yes," said Walter sadly. "These board members kept telling me I could not receive more funding because it was not meant to be. and that I would never be able to accomplish my dreams. Your dreams? Asked Victoria. All I wanted was a little bit of money, enough to sustain your future, your children's future, and your children's children's future, replied Walter. However, the Board of Ordinals decided my request was too lofty and proceeded to focus on other useless things, such as taxing people, collecting more things to put in their room, and learning more. Like they need anything else. His voice trailed off for a moment, then he said, One thing that these Ordinals possess that I truly desire is their immortality. They can live forever without dying, and I desire that as well. No one can live forever, said Victoria. That is where you're wrong, said her father with a laugh. The Ordinals keep it locked up, and I intend to get some and bring it back for us to share. Share? Asked Victoria. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed the robot's gazes were fixated on her and Walter, which gave her goosebumps that chilled her to the bone. Of course, responded Walter. I'm going to take my infinite robot army, bust down the walls of the Ordinals, and take what is rightfully owed to me. He stopped for a moment, then said, What they rightfully owe us. He smiled at Victoria again. However, his daughter did not smile back. What's wrong? He asked gently. You're going to use an army of robots to steal something from somebody else? Asked Victoria. It's not as bad as it sounds, assured her father. I told you before I departed I would find a way to help us make it through. And I wanted you safe above all else. Think about it, you and me living forever. Living the high life. Victoria slowly began to back away from Walter. This is wrong, Daddy, she said quietly. What are you talking about? Asked Walter with a little laugh. We have every right to have this just like anyone else. But if these people didn't give it to you, there had to be a reason, said Victoria, and I think I'm beginning to see why. Nonsense, laughed Walter again, this time with a hint of madness that Victoria didn't like. Where's your sense of adventure? You always talked about how you always dreamed of being in one of those movies where good fights evil. Well, now is your chance. Victoria began to back away a little quicker now, and Walter, who noticed, began to advance upon her. Where are you going, Victoria? He asked. Come here. Give me a hug. No, shouted Victoria. She began to run away back down the balcony towards the door. Come back, shouted Walter as he chased after her. Victoria didn't care. She kept on running as fast as her legs could go. When she reached the door, it dawned on her she could not escape without the pocket watch. She immediately turned around and ran back towards her father. Her father held his arms open wide as if he were expecting a hug from her. This was Victoria's chance. She punched her father square in the face and snatched his watch. Immediately, she ran towards the door. Wah! Shouted Walter as his swollen face began to bleed. He slowly got up and pointed a shaking finger at Victoria and said, Capture her! I want her back alive! Go, go, go! Victoria then heard the sounds of many robots running towards her. She opened the door and realized Jack and the lead robot and the newly created one were all waiting for her. Jack had his gun drawn, and both of the robots' eyes were glowing bright scarlet. Immediately, robots flooded the factory room and drew their weapons and pointed them at Victoria. Walter emerged from the room, and a moment later he put his arms up. Victoria, I'm willing to put all of this behind us, he said. I'm very hurt you would punch me. Give me back my watch, and I'll let you go home. I will do anything as long as you return that watch to me. No, snapped Victoria. I don't know what you're playing at, Victoria, said Walter. Give me the watch. Now. Never. I will not allow you to commit mass genocide, snapped Victoria back. Walter approached her with his hands still in the air and said, Look, Victoria, I understand it doesn't sound right at first. Perhaps we can sit down and talk about it together. I could make people in our old world remember you again. You made them forget? Shouted Victoria. You did this to me? In her anger, she slammed the watch onto the cold metal ground. No! Shouted Walter. He made a mad dash to grab it, but Victoria brought her foot down and smashed the glass of the watch. There, said Victoria, satisfied with her work. Now what are you going to say about taking me home? Oh, we're far beyond negotiations, said Walter in a dangerous voice that borderlined cruel. He snapped his fingers and 2 guards approached her. "What?" began Victoria, but a moment later, she was knocked unconscious. Chapter 6: The Mechanical Colossus. Victoria opened her eyes to see a hazy, steam-lit room. Memories slowly flooded back into her mind. The last thing she remembered was being knocked out. Her father had betrayed her, and he planned to commit mass genocide against the Ordinals. She had no idea what to do. "I was hoping we could rule together," echoed Walter's voice from somewhere above. Victoria raised her head and noticed that Walter was standing on a platform overlooking the room she was in. "But I realize you have every right to do what you want," said Walter. "Because you will not join me, I have no choice but to destroy you. After all, if you go tattling to the Ordinals, my surprise attack would be for nothing." He turned to walk away, but then said, "I hope your death is quick and painless, for your sake." He laughed maniacally. And Victoria could not believe she had called this man her father. "You are pathetic," she shouted. "I know you'll thank me one day," shouted her father back with just as much madness as before. He then walked away, still laughing like mad. This is when a deep robotic croak echoed throughout the semi-dark room Victoria was trapped in. Heavy metal footsteps echoed throughout the chamber, and Victoria realized she was not alone in this dark, scary room. A massive shadow was looming closer and closer to her. 6 faint red pricks of light coming into view through the haze. Victoria immediately began to back away from whatever was approaching and slowly got to her feet. More heavy footsteps came in response. The faint red lights became more vibrant as the massive silhouette approached her. Victoria shook all over as out of the haze stepped the most massive, most frightening-looking robot she had ever seen in her life. The bare hydraulics, worn steel frame, and faded red lights coming together to form a hideously disturbing concoction. The colossal machine took another step towards Victoria and raised a massive metal arm, intending to crush her with it. Victoria immediately ran for it as the heavy arm came crashing down into the ground. Boom! The arm slowly raised, and more footsteps echoed across the room, coming closer and closer. Boom! Victoria's heart was pumping so hard, she felt as if it were going to jump out of her chest. This machine was the stuff nightmares were made of. The machine raised its massive arms again and brought it down hard onto the ground, making the room quiver at the sheer force of the blow. Victoria kept running around the room as fast as she could as the beast chased after her. It was there for the long game, and she knew it. She would eventually get tired and run out of energy, after which the robot would happily smash her to death. She tried not to think about such things, however, and focused on running away. As she desperately racked her brain, trying her hardest to think about something to prove useful against a massive robot. She was so busy thinking she did not notice the crack in the ground, and she tripped, falling flat onto the floor. It was over. The machine loomed towards her, its massive footsteps getting closer and closer. Soon it was a few meters away, then a few feet, then it stopped. Victoria slowly looked up and listened carefully. She could faintly make out a high-pitched sound emitting from the machine. Echolocation. The machine couldn't see her. After a few moments of emitting its frequency, the machine lumbered its way back towards the darkness it had come from. A smile slowly crossed her face, and she rolled her way across the ground, taking great care to be as quiet as possible. She had figured out a way to evade detection. But how would she get out? She carefully brought herself to be level with the wall and made her way towards where the machine had been seen last, being careful not to protrude out from the wall too far. After a minute of walking, the faint red lights came into view, and the sounds of echolocation could be heard. It was still listening for her. Victoria silently took a breath in, and the machine jerked its head in her direction, its faint red eyes glowing a dark red for a brief moment, before slowly fading out again and going back to idle. Victoria carefully walked behind the machine and noticed a pair of heavy metal doors on the other side of the robot's chamber. The Colossus stood next to the doors as if it were guarding them. Victoria could hear the mechanical gears inside of it rotating loudly. This is where she stood for a long time, trying to think of a way to get the doors open without the robot hearing her. Then Victoria had a plan. "Hey, stupid!" she shouted. The mechanical giant jerked its head in her direction. "Yeah, I'm talking to you," laughed Victoria. "Come and get me, you bloke." The robot curled its massive, stubby metal fingers into a fist and advanced towards her angrily. It raised its fist and prepared to smash her, but at the very last second, Victoria jumped out of the way and the Colossus smashed the door open. Victoria's plan had worked. She quickly slipped through the hole, but to her dismay, the Colossus followed her in hot pursuit. Had she just made her situation worse? No. She had more room to run now. She quickly bolted down the massive hallway until she came to a flight of metal stairs, and the sounds of machines running could be heard from above, over the thunderous footsteps of the mechanical Colossus. She turned and could see the faint red lights of the six-eyed robot, and she quickly ran up the stairs. She didn't care she was leading it towards her. As soon as Victoria ran up the stairs, she realized it was filled with robots. Robots immediately turned and pointed their guns at her. "Halt!" said one of the robots. The robot who appeared to be in charge approached Victoria and said, "Did you really think you could come up here by yourself? We outnumber you 60-1. Nice try. Get back into your cell." "Who says I'm alone?" asked Victoria. At that moment, the Colossus burst through the ground as it made its way up the stairs. Screamed the robots as their screams faded into dial-up and back into the sounds of their screams. The robots dropped their weapons and ran in every direction imaginable. The Colossus gave a series of echolocation pitches, carefully watching all the robots running frantically on the ground, clearly confused as to which one was Victoria. This was Victoria's chance. She ran as fast as she could go away from the scene as the Colossus began stomping on various robots in the vicinity. She was hoping neither her father nor Jack would be waiting for her when she made it into the next room. She exited the main room and noticed that all of the robots were gone. The factory was abandoned. Her father had already left to attack the Ordinals. Victoria had to do something about it. She quickly ran back into the room with the panicking robots and the Colossus. "I'm over here, you jerk!" she shouted. The Colossus jerked its head up and began to stomp its way towards her, its sharp fingers outstretched as if it wanted to tear her apart. Victoria led it over to the assembly line where the robots were still being created and tricked the Colossus to smash this too. At least her father could not create any more robots. Now came the hard part, to stop him from killing everyone else. Chapter 7. The Second Escalator. Victoria ran as fast as her legs could go towards the opposite end of the factory, the massive mechanical Colossus following close behind. She ran towards the opposite end of the room and realized that there was nothing but a blank stone wall. She was trapped. She pressed herself flat up against the wall, but the Colossus kept coming, almost as if it knew it had blocked her into a corner. Victoria looked to her left. The assembly line was blocking her path. She looked to her right and realized there was not enough space to slip past the gargantuan robot. The robot stopped, raised its massive arms, and prepared to kill. Victoria backed up as close as she could to the wall, with the hopes that the machine's echolocation would fail to detect her again. The robot brought its massive fists down, however they hit the wall instead. The force of the slam was so fierce that the wall spun, and a second later, Victoria found herself on the other side of the wall. She frowned and looked around. She could hear the robot slamming its massive fists on the other side, trying to get at her, but it occurred to her that this wall was a massive revolving door. After a moment of frantic searching, she found a box housing many large gears and pulled a switch labeled lock. She could relax now. Victoria slowly turned around and noticed a massive black escalator, similar to the one she had seen in Aleph Knoll. It appeared to go on forever. She cautiously approached it and began to follow it up. It was eerily quiet as she went up higher and higher. No sound except her thoughts. Not even the escalator itself gave the slightest bit of sound. This creeped Victoria out, but she knew her only option was to go up. As she went, she could hear voices arguing. Victoria wanted to duck down, however the escalator kept pushing her up. She frantically yet quietly ran down the escalator with no effect. She was heading straight for the two voices. Were they friend or foe? She then recognized her father's voice and her heart stopped. She was about to be captured again. She tried her hardest to silently walk down the escalator while still listening to the argument. "Is $10,000 not enough for you?" screamed Walter. "I told you I would not go any higher." That was before a room with everything ever created was brought into the picture, snapped Jack's voice. "I want more than $10,000 for my services." "You agreed to $10,000, and that is what you shall get," said Walter. The sounds of a gun being cocked could be heard, and Victoria realized Jack was about to shoot Walter. A room of everything? That explained why Walter wanted to go there so badly. Was there truly an immortality device in there? Questions swam through Victoria's mind as she listened to the conversation. Just then, the sound of a hard punch could be heard and a gun going off. "That is what you get for betraying me," came Walter's voice coldly. The sounds of footsteps could be heard echoing on the tile, slowly fading away, suggesting that Walter was leaving. A moment later, the footsteps could no longer be heard, and Victoria decided to ascend the rest of the way. She looked at the ground and gasped. Jack was laying on the ground, blood dripping down his lip and out of his nose. He had a black eye, and it was evident almost immediately what had happened. Victoria cautiously approached him. He wasn't moving. Victoria carefully looked at his gun and checked it and found there were 2 bullets left inside. She pocketed the weapon and looked at Jack's body. "Rest in peace," she murmured. She then ran down the hall after her father. Though the footsteps of Walter could no longer be heard, Victoria knew he could not have been far behind. Knowing he had killed someone with a punch was making her nervous. Walter had taken down a hired gangster, and there was no doubt in her mind he could take her down too. As she rounded a corner, she found a massive metal door with a combination lock on it. Spray painted onto it in bright orange letters were the words Epsilon Naught. She looked around to be sure nobody was behind her and carefully looked at the combination. Various symbols attached vertically to the locks representing some unknown meaning were completely alien to her. She was stuck. She looked around at the hallway leading to the locked door and sighed. She slumped against the wall and thought for a while. There had to be a way to get the door open, otherwise her father would have not gone through it. She then frowned and approached one of the symbols. Wasn't that a sideways U? She then looked at the symbol next to it, and it looked like an upside-down letter P. Up. She looked up, and to her surprise there was no ceiling, just an endless void of nothing bordered by walls that extended beyond what she was able to see. Victoria, who was beginning to catch on to everything being odd in this place, grabbed one of the locks and climbed onto it. She then grabbed the next lock in the vertical configuration and slowly but steadily made her way up the door. She really hoped the Colossus would stay down the escalator and not come lumbering after her. She would be an easy target for anyone while hanging like this. After reaching the top of the door, she felt a strong whoosh of air, and she was shot straight up into the endless void above her, as if she were being sucked by a vacuum. She rose into the dark faster and faster. She could feel herself accelerating far beyond anything she thought possible. Then a moment later, she found herself floating in a very odd landscape filled with floating debris. Transparent tetrahedrons, cubes, and prisms were floating about, the only evidence of their existence being their glowing white edges and their warped reflective surfaces, almost as if they were made out of liquid glass. Victoria slowly landed onto an odd fractured part of a building, which was also floating in space, and cautiously took a step forward. She looked around and noticed a sign with bright white text with a dark black background. The sign stated, 0 equals 1. This made little to no sense to Victoria. How could 0 equal 1? There was no such thing. Well, 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 Victoria, came Walter's voice. Victoria immediately looked around worriedly, jerking her head and almost immediately pulling Jack's gun out of her pocket and aiming it in every direction frantically. I see you escaped your death, continued Walter. A pity. He slowly approached her from the darkness on another chunk of floating building a few feet away. Victoria immediately turned the gun to aim at him. Her hands were shaking and drenched in sweat. Welcome to 0 equals 1, shouted Walter. Welcome to where logic breaks. Chapter 8. Logic Breaks. Walter smiled wickedly at Victoria and asked, "Are you going to shoot me, Victoria?" He snickered a little. "We could have done this together, you know, side by side. We could have defeated the Ordinals together." He reached out a hand and said, "I'm going to give you one last chance. Join me or perish." "No!" shouted Victoria. "Then you leave me no choice," said Walter. "Men!" Suddenly, a pair of red eyes flickered into the darkness beyond Victoria's vision. Then another pair, and another, and another. Soon enough, Victoria realized that she was not alone in this cold, unforgiving domain with her father. "Kill her on my signal," said Walter with a villainous smile. Dozens of guns could be heard locking and loading. Victoria tried her hardest to shoot, but she couldn't. How could she? Her father had been her only family for years, and to find out he was evil only made her task harder to perform. She tried to force her shaking hands to pull the trigger, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. Did she dare surrender to her father and his army? "Go on, Victoria," said Walter. He put his hands up and said, "Shoot me. See what happens." Victoria lowered her gun and said, "I don't want to kill you." Walter's smile widened and he said, "Very good, Victoria. Now, hand me your weapon." Victoria felt a robot's hand on her shoulder. Its cold metal touching her made her feel chilled, and she reluctantly handed Jack's gun to it. The robot looked it over and took aim at Victoria. "Wait! Stop!" shouted Walter. The robot fired, and to Victoria's surprise, the bullet shot backwards out of the gun and nailed the robot in the chest, and Victoria realized no matter what she would have done, she would have lost lacking this information. Had her father known this as well? Was she trying to defend her or the robot? She wasn't sure. Either way, she was at his mercy, and she reluctantly put her hands up. "Take her away," said Walter. "We move onward towards the Ordinals!" The robots gave a harmonious dial-up sound, and they all proceeded to march from building to building, being careful not to apply too much weight to one side. Otherwise, the floating plane would tip and cause them to fall off. After a little while of navigating the complicated array of floating objects, shapes, and mist, they came to a massive black door with nothing behind it or around it. The words "inaccessible" were written in big white letters on it, and Walter turned around to face the group. "Men!" he shouted. "Our time has come!" The robots all straightened up, and the two holding Victoria gripped her arms tighter, which gave her discomfort. "On the other side of this door is what we desire," Walter shouted. "No longer shall we be restricted to living the lives of poverty. No longer will we have to live in the garbage. No longer will I..." He paused for a moment, and a smile of genuine happiness covered his face. "Will I have to die?" he murmured. He raised a fist into the air and shouted, "Are you with me?"
"Yes, sir,"
replied the robots in their electrical voices as they saluted their leader. "Then let's do this," said Walter. He punched a code into a keypad next to the black door, and a moment later there was a click. Immediately the door swung open, and before them were 12 elderly people sitting at a table. They all had long white beards, and they turned to face Walter when he entered their small dark room. "You are not welcome here," said one in a commanding voice. "Agreed," said a second. "What are you doing here, Walter?" "I'm here to request again for just a little money to improve my life," said Walter with a smile.
"No!"
said all the board members in unison. I beg you, give me a little bit of what is contained in the room of all," asked Walter desperately. "We shall not," replied one of the 12. "Go home, Walter, or we will send you there ourselves." "Oh, but I don't have a home to go back to," said Walter. Check. One of the board members pulled out a stack of papers and looked over the top page and slowly lowered his glasses. "No origin," he murmured. He slowly looked up at Walter and said, "You came from somewhere, that much is evident. How is it that you managed to avoid documentation?" "That is none of your concern," said Walter. "I am demanding you give me a share of what is rightfully mine, or else." "Or else what?" asked one of the board members with a somber croak. "Or else I'll destroy you," said Walter. A moment later, all of the robots began to march into the tiny boardroom. They all raised their weapons. An evil smile slowly crossed Walter's face. "On the count of 3, he said to the robots. 1. Victoria could not believe what she was witnessing. 2, said Walter. "All right, fine," said one of the 12 hurriedly. "We'll let you into the room of all." "Finally," said Walter. He gestured for his army to lower their weapons, and one of the board members nervously fumbled with a key and unlocked a hidden door on the opposite end of the boardroom. A second later, after the sounds of many locks clicking could be heard in the tiny room, the door swung open and a brilliant light flooded the room. "What you seek is in there," said the board member reluctantly. "Finally," said Walter again. He stepped into the room of all and vanished from sight. The robots followed their leader, forcing Victoria to come with as well. They all entered the bright white entry, and after being blinded for a moment, Victoria looked in at the most incredible place she had ever seen. Every building, object, and person was in here, ever created and ever will be created. The room of all. Walter anxiously walked about the shelves, searching for the object that would allow him to live forever. After a moment or two, Walter gave a small gasp, and Victoria broke free of the robot's grasp and ran over to Walter. Her father was standing in front of a strange golden object covered with engravings of people on it. A faint black mist could be seen dancing around it, and Victoria could not shake the feeling that the object was dangerous. Walter reached out a hand for it, but Victoria, by impulse, quickly grabbed her father's hand and said, "Don't." "Why?" snapped Walter. "Don't you see that faint black cloud?" asked Victoria. "Doesn't that concern you?" "Not in the slightest," said Walter dryly. "Now let me go." "No!" shouted Victoria. "I want you safe. If you die from this, you would have thrown your life away on some silly quest. I want my father back." "I have spent far longer than you realize on this so-called silly quest," said Walter. "It's too late to give up now." "But you can't do this," said Victoria. "You can't." "But I can," said Walter. His face contorted in anger, and he snarled, "And I will." He smacked Victoria across the face, and she fell backwards onto the strangely translucent white ground. Victoria immediately grabbed his wrist and held on tight. "I don't want you to die," said Victoria. "I won't die," spat Walter. "Now let go! Now!" "I will not," shouted Victoria. "I have already lost my mother. I will not lose you too." "You lost me a long time ago," whispered Walter. A moment later, he picked up a gun, turned it on her, and then said, "Goodbye, Victoria." He fired his weapon, and Victoria was blasted backward into the air, leaving the room of all far behind. She flew so fast and so far, she shattered through the white walls and entered the world of 0=1. She aimlessly drifted through space as she watched the white blob with the fractured hole in it fade further and further away, her momentum carrying her further and further away from her father. Chapter 9. Evil's Pull. "Victoria," murmured a voice. Victoria opened her eyes and looked around. She had no idea how long she had been drifting for or who the voice belonged to, but she hoped whoever it was did not want anything to do with her. She had had enough of people tricking her and ultimately attempting to kill her. Even floating in space with her thoughts was a welcoming sight. "Victoria," murmured the voice again. "Who's there?" asked Victoria nervously. "I am, that's who," said the voice. "What do you want?" asked Victoria as she looked around wildly, trying to pinpoint the source of the voice. "I am here to help you," said the voice. Victoria looked around even more frantically and asked, "How do I know you will not betray me?" "I will never betray you or forsake you," said the voice. "It has come to my attention that your father, Walter, has been tethered to Evil's Pull." "Evil's Pull?" asked Victoria. "Correct," said the voice. "Evil has corrupted your father's mind and has brought him to the point of no return. You must show him that there is life beyond the living, and that eternal life is given freely and does not have to be stolen, but gifted." Victoria heard these words, then asked, "If eternal life is gifted to everyone, what did he find in the room of all?" "He found a dark relic that will only destroy him from the inside," said the voice. You must stop him from attaining such technology, for if it pollutes him for too long, he will die forever and will never return." "Why are you telling me this now?" asked Victoria. "Because now is the time to tell you," replied the voice simply. Upon hearing this, Victoria could not help but feel comforted by this voice. It was kind, yet powerful, and she knew she was safe. "I'm sending you back to Walter now," said the voice. "Good luck." Moments later, Victoria felt herself flying backwards as she rushed through space on her way back towards the Room of All. Moments later, the white dome came into view and she rushed through the fractured hole, and she crashed into the room, scattering objects in every direction. She ran through the room in search of her dad. After rounding a corner, she realized her father had already begun using the machine, granting false immortality. The machine's black mist was swirling, and a pulsing green orb was flashing. Victoria kicked the machine off of its shelf, and it flew across the room, the pulsating orb dissipating. Walter broke out of his meditative state and shouted, "Not you!" He swung to punch Victoria, but his daughter jumped out of the way just in time. "Stop!" shouted Victoria. "Father, please listen to me." "Never!" screamed Walter. He swung at Victoria again with the obvious intention of knocking her down. "Dad, please listen to me," shouted Victoria. "This relic you found is evil. It will kill you if you keep using it." "But I've already done it," said Walter with a crazed chuckle. "I have become immortal. A few more minutes with that machine, and I will be unable to die forever." He made a mad dash for the machine, but Victoria grabbed his arm and pulled with all her might. "Ugh!" shouted Walter as he tried desperately to reach the machine, struggling hard to overcome his daughter's grip. "Let go!" shouted Walter. "I will not," shouted Victoria. "Listen to yourself. You have been tricked by evil. You must turn your mind away from it quickly before it consumes and completely destroys you." "Never," snarled a voice that came from Walter, who was clearly unlike his own. He jerked his arm, and Victoria let go, and Walter grabbed the machine and ran off with it, laughing like a maniac as he went. As he passed by his troops, he shouted, "Block her path!" The robot's eyes glowed bright scarlet upon hearing this command and formed a blockade to prevent Victoria from making it to the exit. They all raised their guns and aimed for her. She could just make out her father running through the entrance of the room with the device and back into 0=1. At that moment, heavy footsteps could be heard echoing throughout the room, and a moment later, to Victoria's dismay, the massive mechanical colossus slammed through the ceiling of the Room of All and landed close by the robot army. It turned and growled in its robotic voice, its 6 faint eyes pulsating as it scanned the area with its echolocation. So the monster had busted through the door. Victoria had wondered about that. Just then, the robot picked her up. Victoria had forgotten it could find her. A moment later, she found herself face to face with Jack. He grinned at Victoria as he touched 2 wires together on an exposed circuit board on the robot's head. A second later, the robot let go of her. "Jack?" asked Victoria in surprise. "I don't like being tricked," said Jack in his gangster-like tone. He touched 2 other wires together, and the Colossus jerked forward and began to lumber its way towards the robot army. "How did you get here?" asked Victoria, who was clearly impressed. "Mr. Beast here," said Jack, gesturing to the head of the Colossus in which they sat, "had broken through the blast door. I immediately deduced you had escaped and had gone after your mutinous father." He hesitated and said, "No offense." "None taken," said Victoria with a laugh. Jack grinned and pointed 2 more wires together, and the Colossus began to walk towards the exit, squishing the robot blockade as it went. "But I thought you were dead," asked Victoria. "I was not," said Jack with another grin. "I was knocked out. Big difference." "By chance have you seen my gun?" Victoria shrugged. "It doesn't matter in the end," said Jack. "I have something better anyway." He put 2 more wires together, and the Colossus rammed its fists together. "Why did you come back?" asked Victoria. "Why didn't you go after Walter? He's not in this room." "You were in danger," said Jack. "And besides, duty should not get in the way of doing what's right." He gave another comical grin at Victoria, and Victoria smiled back. "You remembered," she said. "Can't say I remember many things," said Jack as he guided the Colossus through the room after squishing the robots and making it jump into the land of 0=1. "But what you told me in Aleph Null stuck with me." With that, he fused a couple more wires together and the Colossus picked up something and handed it to Jack. It was his gun. "Now I feel at home," he said. He checked the barrel and found 1 bullet left, he commented. He shrugged and shouted, "Should be enough." "Enough for what?" asked Victoria. "To exact my revenge," said Jack. With that, he slipped off of the head and landed onto one of the floating building walls. "Oh no," murmured Victoria. She too jumped off of the Colossus, who moments later, without anyone controlling its circuits, fell off of the building wall and into the abyss. Victoria landed on the ground and took off running after Jack, who had his gun aimed at Walter. Walter turned to face Jack when he reached the edge. Jack had him cornered and Walter put his hands up. "What do you want, Jack?" he snarled. "Give me more than $10,000, insisted Jack. So that is why he had come back. Not for Victoria, but to get paid more. Victoria sighed and said, "We will let you go if you drop the device off the edge," said Victoria. "And pay me what is owed," insisted Jack. "Jack, there's a room full of everything right over there," said Walter with a nervous chuckle. "I also want revenge for you punching me," snapped Jack. He cocked the gun and said, "Goodbye, Walter." Just then, Victoria remembered what happened to bullets in 0 = 1. "Wait!" she cried, but Jack had already fired. The bullet fired backward and penetrated his body, sending Jack backward. "Ha!" laughed Walter. "You fell for it. It pays to be on time, you know." He began to walk towards the shaft where the locked door was, but Victoria blocked his way. "Get out of my way, Victoria," he snarled. "I will not," said Victoria. "You are the most annoying person in the universe," said Walter. "One tries their best," said Victoria with a smile. Walter towered over her and said, "I can't die now. You are too late." He turned and noticed Jack slowly crawling across the ground. "What is this?" he asked with a maniacal laugh. "What are you trying to prove, Jack? You're not going to win. I do not have a care about your dumb paycheck. Buzz off. Go home. It has been fun getting to know you." He walked over to him and said, "Goodbye." He was about to kick Jack off the edge when the gangster grabbed his leg in mid-swing. As Jack soared through the air towards the edge, his body weight pulled Walter off of his feet and over the edge with him. The two fell down, down, down from the view and out of sight. Victoria could not believe what had just happened. Her father was dead, taking his treasured relic with him into the abyss, never to be seen again. Epilogue. Victoria stared at the abyss for a long time. Her father had been a good man, corrupted by the powers of evil, which he had pursued to the bitter end. She could not help but feel sorry for him, a misunderstood man just trying to help his family, to help her. Victoria sat down and thought about what had just happened. She put her hands in her pockets and realized that there was something in it. She reached into it and pulled out her father's pocket watch, which was littered with cracks as if it had been carefully put back together again. She toyed with it in her hands for a moment, then realized that it opened up. She gently pressed the latch, and the watch swung open to reveal the inner workings. Amongst the gears was a small sheet of folded paper. Because she had nothing better to do, Victoria pulled it out and unfolded it. It was her father's handwriting. "Dear Victoria, if you are reading this, I will be long gone. I just wanted to say I am terribly sorry for how I treated you in Omega. I realize you did not want to join me, and I should not have been acting so rashly. I still intend to pursue my destiny. However, if you are still interested, I'd be delighted to let you join my project again. We can live like royalty forever, never worrying about food or payment cuts ever again. I hope you will reconsider my request. Much love, Walter." Victoria read this letter several times through, then she burst into tears. Had her father really been more human than she had given him credit for? All he had wanted was a better future for her. Now she felt awful that he couldn't have made amends and set things right. But he was gone now, and there was nothing she could do about it. She got up from her spot and walked back down towards the shaft that had brought her up there. "Your father was a good man," said a croaky voice behind her. Victoria turned around quickly, and standing there before her was one of the board members. "His heart was desperate, and in that desperation he seeks the counsel of one whom should never be trusted." He sighed heavily. "His death is regrettable, but so is his decision to join the wrong side." More tears fell from Victoria's eyes into the letter in her hands, and the elder smiled at her. "You tried your best, Victoria. That is all that matters." He smiled at her, then said, "If you want, we can send you back home." Victoria looked up and said, "You can?" "Of course," said the elderly man. "Walter went to extreme lengths to hiding the both of you from our records, but we found them in the end. We can send you back to the exact spot to where you started." "Could you send my father back?" asked Victoria hopefully. "Wouldn't he be in the room of all?" The board member sighed and said, "Unfortunately not. When one pursues the path of evil and goes to great lengths to remove themselves from history, it is near impossible to get them back. The room of all's copy of him was purged when he entered. He probably assumed that becoming immortal there was no need for it." The board member sighed again and then said, "As I said, we can send you back to your own home. What do you say?" Victoria turned to the elder, then nodded silently. "Very well," said the board member. He clapped his hands, and instantly bright white engulfed Victoria, and she was transported back into her home. Though she lived many years after this, she never forgot her father and how much she loved him. One day she hoped she would see him again. And that, my friend, is the story of Victoria. The end.